Hello students, this is Professor McDonald, and this will be some of my comments for Chapter 12, which is Arson, Bombings, and Hate Crimes. Just as an introduction, fires that are set by arsonists and explosive placed to damage property and kill or inflict injury on people are crimes both against person and property. So with arson, you can have a property crime and a personal crime. Normally these crimes are surrounded by great secrecy, the fire setting or the placing of explosives, and they're difficult cases for investigators to investigate. Arsons and bombings may be directed at persons, organizations. The perpetrator in some cases just wants to strike out against either a person or a government, say for example, in the form of a hate crime. In particular with hate crimes, it's directed at a person or a group of persons. It could be based on their ethnicity, it could be based on their race. As an investigator, as a criminal investigator, you must determine whether the fire, first of all, was it a natural or accidental in origin. And if that's the case, then it's not an arson, it's not a crime, it's just an accidental fire. But if it was purposely set, then it falls under the crime of arson. There are many motives for arson, and they can include, like I said, hate fires, for profit, to conceal another crime. For example, even at times, people will murder people and in a house, say for example, and they'll burn the structure to try to destroy evidence. When they talk about for profit, I worked a major case once where an attorney, he owned a large building, and he couldn't get a tenant to rent the building, so it was becoming a financial burden on him and his company. So he hired an arsonist to burn it down so he could collect the insurance money and then just write this thing off. So what that means is he'd no longer have that burden of paying for a building that he couldn't fill. And fortunately, the fire department was able to put the fire out before the entire building went up. And I became involved because I was an inspector and I was working a lot of insurance fraud cases where they were using the mails. And we were able to identify the individual who was behind this. It was a prominent attorney, a local attorney. This was down in Alabama. So that would be one for profit. Structural fires, they have a particular burn pattern, and this is an important part of the investigation. It's important to understand that if you work arson investigations, these are highly trained professionals. They know how to read a fire. They know how to walk in, look around, and determine whether, many times, sometimes they can't figure out what happened, but a lot of times there are indicators of whether arson is involved. They work very closely with the fire marshal and the other fire professionals that respond to these fires, and so it is a very highly skilled position within the criminal investigative field. So again, they're looking for fire ignition, the place of origin. The fire scene itself is a crime scene, so you have to take pictures, you have to collect evidence. Sometimes fires are the result of explosions, and this could be it could be a terrorist act, where a fire is set to burn a building down with individuals in it, that sort of thing. And what they've done also is, in the use of explosives, one of the types of explosives that are used is what they call bombs that are made using fertilizer, say for example. Tim McVeigh used a major fertilizer bomb where he used ammonium nitrate soaked in fuel oil. And at the federal level, they've started a program called using coated microparticles called taggants. That's Taggants. And they include these taggants in the explosives during the manufacture. And as an investigator, these are very valuable. So if there is a major explosion and law enforcement is doing a crime scene examination, they can recover these taggants. And with these taggants, they have numbers on them, and we can track the actual components of the bomb, let's say if it is fertilizer, like the example I gave you, they can track it back to the manufacturer. Many times they can track it to the individual or to the company that bought that particular lot of fertilizer, say for example. And so these tag-ins can help the investigators lead them back, hopefully, to the individuals that are involved in the bombing. And that's important too, because many times with explosions, much of the physical evidence is destroyed. And so motive, trying to determine out motive and opportunity are important elements of the investigation. And so things like tag-ins, any sort of advantage that the investigators can obtain in trying to solve the case is very, very important. I've been on the scene of multiple bombings, in particular pipe bombs, and I've seen the damage and the destruction that these bombs can make. But it is a crime scene, and I've seen crime lab personnel do some amazing things. I responded to we had a mail bomb back in the early 1980s investigation I was part of, and it was a package with a very powerful pipe bomb that was in it, and it didn't kill the intended victim, but it hurt him pretty bad. But it exploded in his office, and when I went in there, I just couldn't believe it. I mean, the biggest piece of evidence was about the size of half a postage stamp. Our crime lab people came in, they used vacuum cleaners, they vacuumed up that evidence. It was absolutely amazing to me. They put that parcel back together, just like a jigsaw puzzle. And they actually recovered one of the stamps that had been placed on the package, and they found a fingerprint on the back of the stamp, which tied it into the primary suspect. And that was the key piece of evidence that led to that person's conviction. And when we think about hate crimes again, organizations that have been involved in these type of crimes, we're talking about like the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nation, some of the skinheads organizations, perhaps targeting African American churches. You've heard about these things. And it's not just those type of groups that can be involved in using arson as a tool to commit a hate crime. Now let's talk about the crime itself. The facts that must be proved in any prosecution for arson as follows. Number one, you have to prove that a fire occurred, a burning, a charring. That's an important term, char. So the whole building doesn't have to go down. If you just have a charring if you can prove that a charring occurred where there was somebody tried to set the building on fire, say for example, that's all you need. You have to prove that the burning was not accidental. Its origin was a result of a criminal agency, in other words, a criminal act. And the person who appears as defendant in court in an arson case has to be identified as the person who set the fire or caused it to be set, or otherwise acted in furtherance of a criminal plan for the fire setting. So you can have a criminal conspiracy case. A conspiracy, as we know, is two or more persons. There has to be an overt act, which in this case could be the fire. So if you had a fire for arson, remember the case I talked to you about with the lawyer? Well, the lawyer was part of the conspiracy. He could be charged as a principal. He hired an arsonist who actually prepared and set the fire. That person is also a principal in the crime. And anybody else that would be involved in that crime to assist in its carrying out could be charged. So those are the elements of proof that have to be proven to convict a person of the crime. There's also a crime called aggravated arson. And that reflects, and the laws have been designed. This is more of a more serious crime of arson, with arson as a crime against people as well as property. So not only are they targeting the property, but also individuals. And the elements of proof there are that explosives are used, or people are present at the site or are placed in danger. So if you set fire to a building that's occupied, then you prove the elements of arson. If you can add these additional elements, then you have what we call aggravated arson, and the defendant will be facing much more serious crime, and if convicted, can be sentenced to much more longer time in prison. remember also that we like to find out what motive is, but again, it's not an element of the crime. So it's not necessary to prove motive in an arson prosecution in order to convict the defendant, as long as the defendant can be identified as the fire setter and his or her intent to set the fire is established. Now, a concept called the suspicious fire concept, and this is where the investigator gets involved. In investigating a burning, the investigator must first seek evidence to prove whether the fire was of natural or accidental origin. So the first thing you're going to look for is see, hey, was this an accidental fire? Was it intentionally set? The fire marshal can be of great assistance there because they're also trained into what to look for and the type of evidence that they might observe when they're actually extinguishing the fire. The next step is to seek evidence to eliminate all possible causes except incendiarism, or where somebody purposely set the place on fire. And so you're gonna try to determine whether this thing was an accident before you start thinking arson. Okay, now it might, as soon as you get to the fire scene, a trained fireman and arson investigator, it might jump right out at them. They can see that, hey, they can smell gasoline or whatever. They can look at the fire itself and get a feel for it pretty quickly. But again, you want to eliminate accidental fires or before you assume that it is an arson. And the third step is to seek evidence that will prove the fire was of an incendiary origin. What kind of evidence would you need? Well, if you see multiple fires in different areas, let's say within a building, I mean, that's not something that's going to naturally occur. It looks like somebody set different fires in a building at different locations. Residue of inflammables. And so, like I said, residue, when things like gasoline and oil and these things burn, there is a residue that they leave behind, and there are telltale signs to tell the investigator what may have occurred. Odor of petroleum or accelerants, you can smell it. Sometimes there'll be holes in walls where perhaps they drilled through and trying to set a particular or a method of setting the fire. So this is the type of evidence they're looking for. They're also looking for evidence. Sometimes the perpetrators will try to lock doors, things of that nature, to try to inhibit the firefighters from actually being able to come in and put the fire out. If it's an arson for profit, you're going to investigate the individual who owns the building. If it's a building, say, that's under investigation, did they increase their insurance? Or is it a situation like I explained where that attorney had a large building that he couldn't rent out? He was starting to lose a lot of money on it. These are the type of things that would help prove a case of arson. And also the presence of ignition devices, something that would have helped set the fire. Arsonists, professional arsonists, are very unique. They have a signature as to how they do set these fires. So these are things that can be uncovered during the crime scene investigation. And again, once the suspicious nature of the fire has been determined, then we're going to look at different things. Is there a rational motivation? In other words, was the fire based on they hated somebody or profit? Or are they trying to conceal a crime? Like I told you before, perhaps maybe somebody, it's not unusual for murderers to set fire to their victims, either in a house or in a car, to try to cover up evidence. If it's a hate fire, then you would, as an investigator, you would try to determine exactly what that motivation could be. Is it an argument? Is it two individuals that don't get along? Is it an employer-employee situation? Is it racial? Is it religious? Is it a political dispute? Normally your profit fire setters, they're motivated by collecting insurance money. That's their primary motive, or to cover up crimes, as I've already talked about. One of the terms you'll hear is a pyromania. Pyromania, that's the obsessive impulse to set fires. And individuals that are pyromaniacs, they actually get a pleasure, and it almost resembles an irresistible itch to be involved in setting fires. Now, in your investigation, the there are different factors that influence the patterns of the fire itself, and these are things that have to be discovered. And I'm not going to read all these. You can read these in the textbook yourself. But sometimes just the physical characteristics of the building can have an impact on the direction of the fire. Ventilation, obviously oxygen, is the lifeblood of a fire. And again, if there's combustible materials that are utilized or even housed in a building, that could have an impact on the fire. You have flashover, which is a rapid development of a fire that occurs when the volume of the active fire becomes a significant portion of the room volume. So these are some of the more professional terms and descriptive terms that are the common language of an arson investigator. And so take a look at those. And there's an interesting picture on figure 12.1 on page 221 where it kind of shows the normal fire path in structural fires, how fires actually react. There's a predictability to them. They're very unique. And again, we talked about accelerants, and these are things that we'll use to accelerate the ignition of a fire, and devices. I mean, you could have a mechanical delay device. I have seen that in fires where somebody had it set up where maybe they had a hot light bulb that was surrounded in tissue papers that once the current went to that light bulb, once it got to a certain degree of temperature, it ignited the papers around it, which then in turn ignited the accelerant. So you could set a fire that you could plan. A professional arsonist, he can plan when he wants that fire to go off, 12 o'clock, midnight or whatever. He doesn't have to run in there, set it, and run out the door. They can set it up where it'll go off at a later time. Take a look at these terms, plant and trailers, in your reading. And again, when you're at the fire scene, one of the key things you want to know is who reported the fire. Sometimes individuals that are around the fire that actually observe the firefighters putting the fire out might actually be involved in the crime themselves. And sometimes it's even been known, if you go on, you probably have heard this, that firefighters sometimes set fires. It's almost like they want to make themselves look like a hero, and they're the ones to report a fire they set themselves. There's a good figure 12-2. I'm not going to read all this to you, but it's a very good visual on how these investigations will work, from observing the burn pattern, the witnesses, the photographs, to the fire scene. Again, you have a crime scene here, just as if it was a murder case or a rape or a robbery case. Setting up the theory of the fire, and once a theory is developed, then the investigator, he's reconstructed the fire, he develops his theory about it, and then he has to collect evidence to prove that theory. And then the basic leads, you've got investigative leads that you're going to follow. Trying to figure out who had the opportunity, the motive, what are the reasons, who would benefit the most from this fire, and then it goes on to identification, arrest, and case preparation. These are difficult cases to work, and it takes highly professional people. And when you actually get a suspect, hopefully, in the best case scenario, if a suspect is identified rather quickly, when this person is apprehended and taken in custody, you definitely want to collect as evidence their outer clothing and their shoes. And this is common sense, because you may, the forensic examination of their clothing and shoes may contain residual traces of the materials that were used to set the fire, including accelerants, etc. The chapter also talks about bombings, and many times bombings, very critical investigations. I've worked on several bombing cases. The crime scene can be condensed into a small area, or it can be a major area. Look at 9/11. Look at the Oklahoma City bombing. These are major crime scenes that cover large And all these crime scenes have to be processed and evidence collected, all trying to determine the cause of the fire, the bombing, the type of explosive that is used, are there any witnesses, trying to develop a theory on the bombing. This is where you work very closely with your police intelligence agencies in today's world of terrorism. Is this a terrorist act? And if so, can we connect it to a particular individual or to a group of terrorists that are involved? Who would have the motivation to do this? Does anybody claim responsibility? And then you work these cases just like any other major criminal investigation. And again, the motivation in bombings could be political. It could be with your extremists and your radicals and your terrorists. It could be organized crime. It could be a bombing to kill a witness against an organized crime. Maybe you have an organized crime case that you've worked, and it's high profile, and you have some real key witnesses, and it's not unheard of for these people to be murdered in bombings. And of course, that is the motivation of that is to destroy the government's case. And then you might have somebody that's mentally ill that just sets bombs. And again, always the defense is always going to be, in most arson cases, whether it be a bombing or whatever, a major terrorist bombing, it's not an issue, but in a lot of arson cases is the defense is going to be the claim that the fire was a result of an accident, natural causes, and if it wasn't caused by natural causes, then the defendant was not the person that did it. Those are your typical defenses that you're going to find. These are complex cases. And these are highly skilled investigators that are involved in these investigations. So make sure you read this chapter very carefully. And if you work in the field, at some point you will be involved. Maybe not as an arson investigator, maybe yes. And you will be involved in these cases, I can promise you. I've had the opportunity in my career to work on some arson cases, and in particular some major bombings. And a lot of the information in this chapter is very, very good relative to how these cases are worked. And that'll be the end of this dictation.